Alright everybody, how are you? I'm Dr. Kevin Jennings, and this is a new course on criminology. And criminology is essentially the scientific study of trying to answer the question, why do people commit crime? And it seems like a pretty simple question, but it's actually really, really complicated. And we're going to go through a whole bunch of possible answers that have been proposed by other researchers to try and answer that question. And you're going to kind of see over the course of this course that it is a much more complicated question than it might seem at first glance. And before we go on, I want to point out that this course is a very kind of surface level understanding of these theories. It is not nearly as in-depth as it could be. Most criminal justice and criminology majors have to take at least one criminology or criminal theory course at every level of education. So there's at least one in the undergraduate level, at least one at the master's level, at least one at the PhD level. And even then, you're not getting into some of the more complicated, deeper understandings of these theories and some further kind of divisions and refinements within the theories. So the course is organized where we talk about kind of the umbrella theory, right? And there's probably at least about a dozen big umbrella theories. And then underneath each umbrella is unique theories that are related but slightly different, proposed by two or three or four, different researchers. And we're going to talk mostly about the umbrella theories and then one or two of the kind of major underlying specific theories for each section. But first we kind of have to talk about what criminology is. And as if anybody has taken any of my other classes, you know that I start each section off with our funny internet picture of the day. And this is the one that I like to use for this class because I do think it is a very important thing to understand and realize that real crime and criminal justice and law enforcement and all those things are nothing like what you see on TV. There are very few television shows that get crime right. So just because you watch, CSI or Criminal Minds or any of the other popular shows out there, that's not real life. Realize it's scripted. Okay? So first, if we're talking about criminology, we have to talk about science because criminology is a science. There are lots of people who can attempt to explain crime in a non-scientific way, religious leaders, philosophers, whatever, and that has its place. But in criminology, we try to do it using science, using research, testable scientific hypotheses and all those things. So the first thing we have to understand is that when we're determining which of these answers to why do people commit crime is the most true, I guess you could say, is reflected the most in the real world, we have to use the scientific method, where we generate a hypothesis, design a plan to research it, accept or reject the hypothesis, and then use that to further either develop or refine a theory. And a theory, when used in scientific context, is a much, much different thing than theory just in use in everyday English, right? If you're talking to a friend of yours, you say, oh, I have a theory why my cat ran away. What you really mean there is you have a guess, right? An idea. In science, a theory is something very, very different. A theory is an explanation for some observed phenomenon that is supported by evidence and testing. Okay? So some of the more famous scientific theories out there are things like atomic theory, the germ theory of disease, evolution is a theory, right? And a lot of people are surprised to learn that gravity is a theory. There's the theory of gravity. But they say, well, isn't gravity a law? Yes, but a law and a theory are two different things. A law is an observation. A theory is an explanation. So yes, there is a law of gravity which says that, if I'm on the planet Earth and I drop something, I drop this hat, it's going to fall at 9.8 meters per second per second. Well, yeah, that's exactly what we observed when I dropped it, and that is the law of gravity. The theory of gravity is an explanation for why, when I drop that object, whatever it is, it falls to the ground at that exact same speed every single time. So, in criminology, we are working towards developing a theory, i.e. an explanation for an event, in this case crime, that we can support with evidence, and reach that kind of pinnacle of having like an actual criminological theory that is accepted by the scientific community, okay? But first, we, just really, really basic stuff here. We have to define what we mean when we say crime. And a lot of people don't like to hear this, but crime is really a social construction. I mean, there is nothing kind of inherent in any criminal act that makes it a crime other than the fact that society has dictated that it is a crime, right? So there are things that either every culture or just about every culture have defined as crimes, right? Like murder. Murder is a crime, or the equivalent of crime in some societies, that basically every society throughout human history has agreed on. But on the other hand, think about that for a while, because there have been a lot of cases and a lot of societies where murder isn't a crime in certain circumstances, right? So a common one is, say, self-defense. If somebody breaks into my house and is trying to kill me, I can kill them back. And so the fact that I'm killing them, and I meant to kill them, isn't necessarily murder. There are some societies in which parents are allowed to kill their children if their children do something wrong, right? So it's difficult to define what we mean by crime, which is one of the things we have to do if we're going to say, why do people commit crime, right? Another great example, I just saw an article on the internet about how wage theft is not a crime, even though it accounts for way more stolen money than things like, embezzlement and fraud and other things that are crime. Companies purposefully underpaying their employees results in far more loss of money than the things we consider crimes. But wage theft by companies is not a crime, because our society has said it's not, and kind of decided it's not. So crime is a strange phenomenon that is absolutely socially constructed, not inherent in any way, right? So what criminologists usually do is they make a distinction between deviance and crime. Crime is something that is against the law, right? So, if I walk up to somebody randomly in the street and shoot them, that is a crime. But then there's deviance, which is things that society kind of knows is wrong, but isn't technically illegal, right? So if I were to walk up to some random stranger and just say, hey, you're really ugly and you're stupid and you should, blah, blah, blah. As long as it doesn't arise to the level of, say, harassment, that's not a crime, right? It would be deviant, but it's not a crime. Other things like, kids disobeying their parents, right? In the United States, that's not a crime, but it is a deviant act, right? So another way to think about this, although different but related way to think about this is mala prohibita versus mala in se. These are Latin terms. Lawyers love to turn everything into Latin. Makes them feel smart, I guess. I don't know. But this is a Latin, and it essentially means, mala prohibita means evil because we say it is, and mala in se essentially translates to evil in itself, right? Now, in the modern world, in the United States, the way this kind of most obviously exhibits itself is on the difference between felony and misdemeanor. felonies are the mala in se, evil in itself, right? Things like murder, rape, robbery, auto theft, all those things that like everybody's going to look at that and be like, yeah, that's bad. Mala prohibita are generally corresponds to things like misdemeanors, right? Like parking tickets, right? It's not illegal to, or it's not evil necessarily to park your car, but because we want society to operate in an efficient way, we've decided that parking on this side of the street from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Is going to be against the law. But it's not necessarily evil in itself. It's evil because we say it is, because we've decided that at that time is when we need to clean the street or whatever. So if somebody's parking there, we can't clean the street. And that generally kind of sort of corresponds to the modern notion of felony versus misdemeanor. But evil because we prohibit it, and evil in itself. Okay? Deviance versus crime. Again, it's a related concept. These, the deviance versus crime and mala prohibita versus mala in se are related, but very, very different at the same time, if that makes sense. Anyway. Now, when we propose a theory of why do people commit crime, there are a few different ways we can identify it or look at them or classify them, right? First way to talk about it is micro versus macro, right? These are pretty common prefixes for lots of words, right? Like if you're a college student, I'm sure you probably know the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics, right? Well, in this case, we're talking about micro theories and macro theories in regards to crime. So a micro theory would explain why Bob Smith committed some crime. A macro theory would say, hey, let's look at this group, whether it's a U.S. state or a country or any other kind of large group of people, and explain why 10% of this group commit crime and only 5% of this other group commit crime, but 40% of this third group commit crime, right? So it's looking at crime, in a group setting rather than why did this one individual person commit some crime. Make sense? We can also talk about them based on their assumptions about human nature, right? Are people inherently good and something has to happen to them to turn them into a criminal? Or are people inherently evil and most of us are controlled by something, but some of us aren't successfully kind of prevented from becoming a criminal, so they express that inherent evilness within them and commit crime. So are people inherently good or are people inherently evil, right? Different theories kind of assume different things, right? So one theory might be like, well, he had to get pushed into doing this because this happened to him. Whereas another theory might say, well, this good thing didn't happen to him, and that's why he went off and committed crime, right? Does that make sense? How the kind of those two different assumptions would result in very different answers to why did somebody commit crime? And then the third thing we need to talk about is what kind of crime do they explain, right? There are some theories that would only really explain, say, economic crime, right? Like theft and embezzlement and fraud and things like that. Other theories might only explain violent crime, right? Some theories would explain all different types of crime, from speeding to murder to treason, right? But we have to kind of talk about or gauge each theory based on what kind of crime does it really explain. So, what makes a good theory? Well, good theories obviously are going to be simple, okay? Prior to Copernicus, we had this theory of the planets and the sun, and everybody believed that all those things rotated around the Earth, or revolved around the Earth. And they had a theory to explain that, but because they were obviously wrong about most of the planets and the sun and everything rotating or revolving around the Earth, it became this really complicated theory of how and why these planets are moving around the sky at night and planning how to track them, and it got more complicated as measurements got better and we got more data and we got better telescopes and all these things. We had to the theory of how these planets were revolving around the Earth got more complicated. Till finally somebody came along and said, hey, they're not revolving around the Earth. They're revolving around the sun, just like we are. And that was a much more simple theory that explained the motion of the planets in the sky as viewed from Earth, right? Second thing we have to talk about is scope of the explanation. Does this only explain digital piracy? Or does this theory explain everything from speeding tickets up through auto theft and rape and murder? Logical consistency. Is it internally consistent? I.e., do each of the kind of propositions make sense when put together into a whole? Right? And we're going to talk about, especially when we talk about the biological theories, you'll see how there's some of these theories that were believed for a long time that just were not logically consistent at all. A very, very, very absolutely critical thing for any theory is testability and falsifiability. Okay? If it's not falsifiable, it can't be science. Now, falsifiable just means, can we prove it wrong? Right? Is it possible to compile evidence and show that, no, this theory is really, really wrong? If it's impossible to do that scientifically, then it's not a theory. Like, it's just, if we can't prove it wrong, there's no point in researching it at all, because there's no point, right? There's nothing for us to do here. And testability is related to that. It just means, can we test whether the propositions of this are, good or bad, or how much of crime they explain. So they're related concepts, but slightly different. Empirical validity is, does that evidence exist, right? So, other people have done research on this. They found correlations between, X and Y, or, what we think causes crime and crime. Does the existing evidence support that theory or not, right? So if I tried to say, wearing a red shirt causes crime, right? Well, it'd be pretty easy to go through arrest records and look at the color of shirt everybody was wearing and say, look, all the data we have shows that, yes, some people who wear a red shirt commit crime, but, we arrest people all the time who committed crimes in blue shirts and black shirts and no shirts and white shirts, and, so that would be a big hit to the empirical validity of my whole does wearing a red shirt cause crime theory, right? And then finally, we have to talk about policy implications, right? So just assuming this theory is true for a second, what does that mean about what we should do as citizens? What does it mean that politicians should do? What does it mean that we should, how should we change our criminal justice system based on the knowledge that we've gained from this theory, right? Because if the policy implications are, we just need to kill everyone or, enslave everyone in a 1984 style, that's not helpful. That's not good, right? So if it doesn't have possible, decent, moral policy implications, that's not a good theory, right? So, causality. If we say that this causes crime, what does it mean to say cause, right? What does that word mean, cause? So, lots of researchers have come up with what we need in order to demonstrate causality. And we usually use the variables x and y, right? Does x cause y? In this case, y is almost, in this class, we're going to almost always be crime of some kind, right? Might be all crime, might be violent crime, might be just fraud, whatever. But y is almost always crime. But does x cause y, right? And there are 4 requirements. A lot of science books and research methods books and stuff will only list 3. But I was taught, and I like to teach my students, that it's 4. And we'll talk about why here in a second. But those 4 requirements. The first is correlation. Okay? If we want to say x causes y, a change in x, either up or down, has to have some kind of effect on y, up or down. Now, I'm hoping you guys have heard the phrase, it's a fairly common phrase, correlation is not causation. That's true. Correlation alone isn't enough to prove causation, but it is required. If there's no correlation, there's definitely no causation, right? So it is necessary, but not sufficient to show causation. So change in X results in some kind of change in Y, up or down, right? But that is only one of the requirements. It's not enough total, right? So second requirement is time order. If we're gonna say X causes Y, we have to show that X comes before Y in time, right? So some of those things are really easy to show, right? So if X is something, say, genetic, genetics causes crime. Genetics is obviously going to come before any actions you take, whether it's criminal or not, right? I mean, your genes are set when your mother was pregnant with you. So that's obviously going to come before time of any crime you may commit in your life. Other times it's not so easy, right? So we're going to talk later about a theory where essentially if you have criminal friends and peers when you're young, that causes you to commit crime. But then we get into this difficulty of time order. Is it the fact that you had criminal friends that causes you to commit crime, or is it the fact that you had the desire to commit crime that causes you to hang out with criminal friends, right? So time order is sometimes very easy to determine. Sometimes it's a lot more difficult, a lot more complicated. Third requirement is called non-spuriousness. Now, if a relationship is spurious, it means that X, when X changes, Y changes, but that relationship is due to some third variable, usually denoted with Z, right? Now, the classic example that is in a lot of criminology textbooks is there's a correlation with ice cream consumption and sexual assault. This is absolutely true. You can look up the data all you want. As ice cream consumption goes up and down, sexual assault numbers go up and down in a very predictable correlation between those two variables. But the problem here is there's no causality between ice cream consumption and sexual assault. The reality is that there is a spurious relationship between ice cream and sexual assault, namely season, right? The season of the year. Crime goes up when people are out and about and doing things more, which happens more in the summer than it does in the winter, where people tend to stay home because it's cold out and nobody wants to go out in the snow. So the fact that ice cream and sexual assault are correlated doesn't mean they're causal, because there is a third variable, temperature, season, that is causing them both to move up and down. Make sense? And those are the three requirements for causality that almost all books or researchers will talk about. But I was taught that there's a fourth, theory. We can't really talk about X causing Y until we have a theory of how and why, right? Why is X causing Y? We have to go in and develop that scientific theory that really explains, okay, there's a correlation. We've established time order. We're pretty sure there's not a spurious relationship between the two. Now we really have to answer, why is X causing Y? So like, let's say for some weird reason, just go with me on this, there's a correlation between red shirts and crime. We've figured out, we established time order. We've pretty sure we've rejected all spurious relationships or possible spurious relationships. Now we really have to ask ourselves, why is it that a red shirt causes crime? Is it like the classic myth about bulls seeing red and that making bulls angry? Is that it? Is it something about, do people wear red so that they can hide from surveillance because they know they're about to be out committing crimes? What's the theory there? So those are the four requirements for causality that are kind of the what we're going to need to establish with these theories we're talking about in this class. So I'm going to end this first subsection here. We're going to come back and talk about measures of crime.